The morning sun cast long shadows across Nellis Air Force Base as retired Colonel Marcus Steele Rodriguez walked through the hangar doors for what he thought would be just another routine visit. At 58, the decorated veteran still carried himself with the sharp precision of his military days, though gray now streaked his once black hair. His weathered hands bore the calluses of countless hours gripping control sticks, and his eyes held the steady gaze of a man who had stared death in the face more times than he could count. Marcus had flown everything from F-16 Fighting Falcons to F-35 Lightning IIs during his 30-year career. He had served 3 tours in Iraq, 2 in Afghanistan, and had logged over 4,000 flight hours in combat missions. But retirement had been harder than any battlefield. The silence of civilian life felt foreign after decades of roaring engines and split-second decisions that meant the difference between life and death. He was visiting the base that day as part of a veterans outreach program, sharing his experiences with young airmen who still had stars in their eyes and dreams of flying the world's most advanced aircraft. As he walked through the hangar, his attention was immediately drawn to the sleek, angular shape dominating the center of the space. The F-22 Raptor stood like a predator frozen in time, its stealth coating absorbing light and giving it an almost otherworldly appearance. Captain Jessica Phoenix Chen, the base's youngest F-22 pilot at 29, noticed the veteran's intense stare. She had heard stories about Rodriguez, how he had once landed a damaged F-16 with no hydraulics, saving not only his own life, but preventing the aircraft from crashing into a populated area in Fallujah. His reputation preceded him, but she also knew that many older pilots struggled with the reality that their flying days were behind them. "Beautiful machine, isn't it, sir?" Jessica said, approaching with the confident stride that marked all fighter pilots. Nothing else in the sky comes close to her capabilities. Marcus nodded slowly, his eyes tracing the aircraft's revolutionary design. "I've read about her specs, watched the videos, but seeing her up close..." He paused, running a hand along the smooth surface of the wing. "She's something else entirely." Jessica smiled, sensing an opportunity to impress the legendary pilot. "The F-22 isn't just about speed or stealth, Colonel. She responds to thought almost before action. The human-machine interface is so advanced that flying her is like becoming one with the aircraft itself. Of course, it takes years of training to master her systems." The comment hung in the air with an unspoken challenge. Marcus caught the subtle implication immediately. He had faced down surface-to-air missiles, enemy fighters, and impossible odds throughout his career, but he was being told that this new generation of aircraft was beyond his capabilities. The younger pilot's words weren't meant as disrespect, but they stung nonetheless. "Years of training, you say?" Marcus asked, his voice carrying the calm tone that his squadron had learned to recognize as dangerous. "And you believe that experience from earlier generation aircraft wouldn't translate?" Jessica realized she might have overstepped, but her competitive nature wouldn't let her back down. "With all due respect, sir, the F-22 requires a completely different mindset. The sensor fusion, the stealth protocols, the supercruise capabilities, it's not like anything that came before. Even experienced pilots from fourth-generation aircraft need extensive retraining." A crowd was beginning to gather as word spread that the famous Colonel Rodriguez was in the hangar. Among them was General Patricia Hayes, the base commander, who had served as a young lieutenant under Marcus years earlier. She approached with a mixture of respect and curiosity, sensing tension in the conversation. "Colonel Rodriguez," General Hayes said warmly, extending her hand. "It's an honor to have you here. I hope Captain Chen has been showing you around properly." "She has indeed," Marcus replied, his eyes still fixed on the F-22. "She was just explaining how this aircraft represents a revolution in air combat, how it requires a completely new approach to flying." General Hayes caught the undercurrent in his voice and glanced between the veteran and the young pilot. She had seen this kind of generational tension before, and she knew Marcus Rodriguez well enough to recognize when his pride had been challenged. "The F-22 is certainly impressive," the general agreed diplomatically, "though I imagine a pilot of your caliber would adapt quickly to any aircraft." Jessica, emboldened by the audience, and perhaps not fully understanding who she was speaking with, decided to press her point. "Respectfully, General, the F-22 isn't about adapting. It's about reimagining what air combat can be. The pilots who excel in the Raptor aren't necessarily the ones with the most traditional flight time." The hangar had grown quiet except for the distant sound of aircraft on the flight line. Marcus felt the weight of every pair of eyes on him, measuring his response. In that moment, decades of training, pride, and an unshakable belief in his abilities crystallized into a single, clear decision. "Fly the F-22, he said quietly, his voice carrying across the silent hangar. The words echoed through the hangar like a thunderclap. General Hayes felt her stomach drop as she realized what Marcus had just proposed. Flying an F-22 wasn't like taking a vintage car for a spin. It required current certification, extensive briefings, and approval from multiple levels of command. The aircraft represented over $150 million in taxpayer money and cutting-edge technology that couldn't be risked on what amounted to a pride-driven challenge. "Colonel, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but you know that's not possible," General Hayes began, trying to diffuse the situation diplomatically. "The insurance alone—" Marcus turned to face her, and she saw something in his eyes that reminded her of the man who had once talked her through her first combat mission over Baghdad when she was terrified and inexperienced. "Patricia, you owe me one favor. You said so yourself after that incident in '03. The general knew exactly which incident he meant. Marcus had violated direct orders to come back for her when her F-16 had been hit by ground fire. He had risked court-martial and his career to ensure she made it home alive. She had indeed promised him one favor, no questions asked, though she had never imagined it would be something like this. The hangar buzzed with whispered conversations as word spread rapidly through the base communication networks. Within minutes, dozens of personnel had gathered, creating an impromptu audience for what was becoming the most unusual event in Nellis Air Force Base's recent history. Jessica Chen stood frozen, realizing that her challenge had escalated far beyond anything she had intended. "Sir, I didn't mean to imply—" Jessica started, but Marcus held up a hand. "No need to apologize, Captain. You stated your position clearly. Now, I'd like the opportunity to demonstrate mine." His voice remained calm, but there was steel beneath the surface that made it clear this wasn't a request. General Hayes found herself in an impossible position. Regulations existed for good reasons, but she also understood that sometimes extraordinary circumstances required extraordinary decisions. She looked around the hangar at the faces watching her, young airmen who had heard legends about Marcus Rodriguez, seasoned mechanics who remembered when pilots were expected to fly anything with wings, and fellow officers who understood the complex dynamics of military pride and tradition. "Give me 20 minutes. She said finally, pulling out her secure phone. "I need to make some calls." Those 20 minutes felt like hours. Marcus spent the time walking around the F-22, studying its lines and asking technical questions of the maintenance crew. Despite the bravado of his challenge, he was acutely aware of the risks involved. The aircraft represented a quantum leap in aviation technology, and while his experience was vast, it was also decades old in terms of the most advanced systems. Jessica watched him nervously, torn between admiration for his confidence and horror at what her words had set in motion. Chief Master Sergeant Williams, the senior enlisted man in the hangar, approached her with a grim expression. "You know who that is, right, Captain?" he asked quietly. That's the pilot who single-handedly took out 3 Iraqi MiGs in one day with a damaged aircraft. The man who's been awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross twice. You just challenged a living legend to prove himself. The weight of her mistake began to settle on Jessica's shoulders. She had seen Marcus as just another aging veteran trying to relive past glory, but the respect she witnessed from every senior member of the base told a different story. This wasn't about an old man's ego. This was about something deeper, something related to the soul of military aviation itself. When General Hayes returned, her expression was unreadable. I've spoken with the Pentagon, the Secretary of the Air Force, and 3 different insurance companies. Against my better judgment and every regulation I can think of, you have approval for a supervised test flight. Supervised being the key word, Captain Chen will be in the back seat, and you'll follow a predetermined flight plan. The crowd erupted in a mixture of cheers and nervous laughter. Marcus nodded grimly, understanding that he had gotten what he asked for, but now had to deliver on a promise made in anger and pride. The next 2 hours were a blur of rapid briefings, equipment fitting, and system familiarization. Marcus absorbed every detail with the focused intensity that had kept him alive through 3 decades of military flying. As they walked toward the aircraft, now fueled and ready for flight, Jessica finally found the courage to speak directly to him. "Sir, I want to apologize. I never meant to question your abilities or experience. I was just trying to explain how different the F-22 is from other aircraft." Marcus stopped and looked at her seriously. "Captain, you weren't wrong about this aircraft being revolutionary, and you weren't wrong about it requiring a different approach. But experience isn't just about flying hours. It's about adapting, learning, and never letting fear make your decisions for you." They climbed into the cockpit, Jessica taking the rear seat that was normally reserved for training flights. As Marcus ran through the pre-flight checks, she was struck by how naturally he seemed to adapt to the unfamiliar controls and displays. His hands moved with the confidence of someone who had internalized the fundamental principles of flight, regardless of the specific aircraft. The F-22's engines spooled up with a sound unlike anything else in aviation, a deep, powerful roar that seemed to vibrate through the very bones of everyone watching. Marcus felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with the moment before takeoff, but also something he hadn't felt in years, the pure joy of being exactly where he belonged. The aircraft lifted off the runway with an ease that surprised even Marcus. The F-22's power-to-weight ratio was extraordinary, and within seconds they were climbing at an angle that would have been impossible in any of his previous aircraft. But as they reached cruising altitude and Marcus began to explore the aircraft's capabilities, something unexpected happened. Instead of pushing the envelope or trying to prove his mastery of the machine, Marcus did something that no one in the hangar or the control tower had anticipated. He leveled off at 15,000 feet and began flying in a pattern that Jessica initially couldn't understand. It was precise, deliberate, and completely different from any training exercise she had ever experienced. High above the Nevada desert, Marcus continued his strange flight pattern while Jessica tried to understand what was happening. The movements were too precise to be random, too purposeful to be simple maneuvering practice. As she watched the GPS display, she began to see that they were tracing letters in the sky, massive letters that would be visible from the ground to anyone tracking their flight path. "Colonel, what are you doing?" Jessica asked over the intercom, her voice a mixture of confusion and growing concern. Marcus's response was calm and measured. "I'm writing a message, Captain, something that needed to be said but couldn't be spoken in that hangar." Below them, the control tower was tracking their unusual flight pattern with increasing bewilderment. The air traffic controllers had expected a straightforward test flight, perhaps some basic maneuvers to demonstrate Marcus's ability to handle the aircraft. Instead, They were watching the most expensive fighter jet in the Air Force inventory trace elaborate patterns across 50 square miles of airspace. General Hayes, monitoring the flight from the base operations center, felt her anxiety mounting. "What the hell is he doing up there?" she muttered, watching the radar track spell out what was becoming increasingly obvious as letters. In the rear seat of the F-22, Jessica finally understood what Marcus was writing across the sky. The first word was clear: thank. As they began the second word, she realized he was skywriting "thank you" in letters nearly 5 miles high, visible to anyone tracking their flight path on radar or GPS. "Sir, I don't understand," Jessica said, though her voice had softened with something approaching awe. Marcus banked the aircraft gently into the final letter, his voice carrying decades of emotion when he spoke. "Captain, you asked me to fly this aircraft to prove something, but the moment I sat in this cockpit, I realized I wasn't here to prove anything to you or anyone else. I was here to say goodbye." The words hung between them as Marcus completed the massive aerial thank you note. Jessica felt tears beginning to form in her eyes as understanding dawned. This wasn't about ego or proving himself worthy of modern aircraft. This was about a man who had given his entire adult life to military aviation, finally finding a way to properly honor that service. "For 30 years, I flew for my country," Marcus continued, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I flew in wars, I flew in peacetime, I flew missions that I still can't talk about, but I never got to properly say goodbye to the sky. Retirement ceremonies are fine for speeches and medals, but this—" He gestured toward the cockpit around them. "This is how a pilot says goodbye." On the ground, word of what was happening had spread throughout the base. Hundreds of personnel had gathered on the flight line, many with binoculars or cameras, watching the tiny speck of the F-22 complete its aerial message. Even those who couldn't see the aircraft directly could follow the flight path on their phones and computers, watching the GPS track spell out words of gratitude across the desert sky. General Hayes stood among them, her initial concern transformed into something approaching reverence. She understood now that she wasn't witnessing an old pilot's desperate attempt to reclaim past glory. She was watching a ceremony as ancient and honorable as any military tradition, a warrior's formal farewell to his calling. "Tower, this is Raptor 27, Marcus's voice came through the radio, formal and professional. "Requesting permission to perform one final maneuver before returning to base." The air traffic controller, who had been following the flight with fascination, responded immediately. "Raptor 27, you are cleared for your maneuver. The pattern is impressive, sir." What happened next would be talked about at Nellis Air Force Base for decades to come. Marcus pulled the F-22 into a steep climb, using the aircraft's incredible power to reach nearly 40,000 feet in a matter of minutes. At the apex of the climb, he performed a maneuver that was part aerobatics, part poetry. A series of rolls and turns that seemed to make the aircraft dance against the blue Nevada sky. But Jessica realized this wasn't showboating or reckless flying. Every movement was precise, controlled, and filled with meaning. Marcus was flying the way she had always dreamed of flying, not just operating a machine, but truly becoming one with the aircraft, expressing something that couldn't be put into words through the pure language of flight. As they descended back toward the base, Marcus's voice was quiet but clear. "Captain, you were right about this aircraft being revolutionary, but revolution doesn't mean forgetting what came before. It means building on it, honoring it, and carrying it forward. The landing was perfect, smooth, professional, and exactly what one would expect from a pilot with over 4,000 hours of flight time." As the engines wound down and the canopy opened, the crowd that had gathered on the flight line began to applaud. It started with a few people, then grew until everyone present was clapping, many with tears in their eyes. Marcus climbed down from the aircraft slowly, his legs slightly unsteady after the emotional intensity of the flight. General Hayes was there to meet him, and for a moment, the formality of rank fell away. "That was beautiful, Marcus," she said simply. Jessica Chen approached them both, her face reflecting a new understanding of what it meant to be a military aviator. "Sir, I owe you an apology. I thought flying was about mastering machines. But you showed me it's about something much deeper." Marcus smiled and extended his hand to her. "Captain, you have nothing to apologize for. You challenged me to fly this aircraft, and in doing so, you gave me something I didn't know I needed, the chance to properly close this chapter of my life." As the crowd began to disperse and the F-22 was returned to its hangar, Marcus looked back at the aircraft one final time. His sky-written message had already begun to dissipate in the desert winds, but its meaning would endure. He had found a way to transform what could have been a moment of conflict into something transcendent, a reminder that true mastery isn't about proving superiority, but about finding grace, gratitude, and closure. Walking away from the flight line, Marcus Rodriguez carried himself with the same quiet dignity he had shown throughout his career. But now there was something different in his step, the peace that comes from knowing that his service had been properly honored, his skills adequately demonstrated one final time, and his farewell to the sky delivered with the respect and reverence that such a moment deserved. The unexpected thing he had done wasn't about proving he could fly the F-22. It was about showing that the truest measure of a pilot isn't found in technical mastery or competitive victory, but in the wisdom to know when it's time to say goodbye, and the grace to do so with honor.